Hi, Daheem.
Hi, Tooba.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the series that we're doing. I am really excited to talk to you because not only have you got more than a decade of experience working in Pakistan with mental health as a therapist with adults, but also particularly with kids, with young adults and children. And one of the things that I'm curious to explore with you is what is the experience of children just growing up in our home environments?
Okay. So, I mean, there's a generalized, we can talk about like a general view of the placement of a child in a family system. Right. Hierarchically, parents are the main who are the authority. The power lies with them to nurture, to care, to provide for the children, and children lie in the second pair. So if you do like a genogram, you'll have the parents and then you'll have the children down here.
Right.
So in family systems, there's a parent subsystem and then there's a sibling subsystem. So generally, so agar aap baat karo, so there's their roles and their responsibilities are all divided. Parents are responsible for providing the nurturing environment, and children are dependent till they become, as they developmentally go through different stages and they become adults themselves, and then they start to care for them. They create those opportunities that have been created for them earlier on in their lives.
Right.
So that's like, like a basic space where a child belongs in a family. Child is dependent, needs that space to be provided for, where they can emotionally, psychologically, physically, cognitively thrive and grow. And like any system, like any culture, that's the case here in our culture too.
Say. But one thing that I always find is that बहुत सारी research जो हम पढ़ते हैं या जो family systems के models होते हैं, they're developed largely from like this anglicized view of a nuclear family, right? And in our systems, a lot of us live in joint families, so it's a very complicated system. It's not as simple as parent, child. So
yeah, totally, Tooba. I mean, I think even that system is not simple. It's very complicated, even a nuclear family system, because when the couples come together, they bring their own families internally. They carry their families and they bring them in.
Right.
So so even a nuclear family system is not a simple one. However, हमारे culture में the joint family system is another layer of parenting, you can say, or another layer of family of origin internally being carried by grandparents. That comes. So very true. And so the placement of the child, remains the same, but has many more parents that parent them than in a nuclear family system.
Right.
So that and in our culture, the child witnesses parents' ka interaction, grandparents' ka interaction, parent and grandparent ka interaction. The child experiences their interaction with the grandparent, with the parent, and it's not sure, it creates a complex, like it's complicated because different people have different generations, I would say, have different point of views or how they look, and the generational gap kind of comes into the parenting and the child rearing practices. Sometimes it becomes a hindrance, sometimes people can overcome it. So it's a mixed bag, for a child to witness this kind of big system, the joint family system that we talk about. It's not always a bad thing. A lot of children they experience so much human interaction.
Right.
There's so much human interaction, to say the least, that you actually develop skills. You can develop skills to deal with all sorts of people around you. And at the same time, the downside can be that, there are so many mixed messages that are coming your way, so many mixed instructions, views of the world that that can be confusing.
Right.
That can actually be confusing for the child too.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, personally, as a practitioner, I've seen, I think joint family has its ups and downs both, and for the child. So, you learn a lot from your grandparent, and at the same time, you witness how the adults in the family, handle conflict. It impacts your relationship with conflict.
Right.
But I mean, that's all there is, and definitely that I completely recognize how it impacts the child's personality. But if we kind of park that for on the side, and we just look at like hamare culture mein, our cultural view of a child's placement in the family is predominantly, there's a lot of that the child doesn't know. आपको समझ नहीं है, आपको पता नहीं है, आपको experience नहीं है, are a lot of messages that the children hear. And that becomes part of their internal structures.
Right.
So just talking about the child's placement, I think what I have witnessed a lot is that the parent position becomes a position of authority in a way in which the child's presence gets overlooked.
Right.
And it's a generational sort of a thing, It's not something, it's like my mother did it and her mother did it, and so it's not something which in our culture is seen as something that needs to be different, though things are changing.
Right.
With awareness, listening to the child and hearing what they're saying or trying to understand or giving them the space is changing. But generally हमारे culture में बच्चे की जगह जो है ना वो ऐसी कि आपको पता नहीं, आपको समझ नहीं, आप क्या, मुझे आपसे बेहतर पता है.
Say you don't know and
because I'm the
I
parent.
know. Yeah.
Yeah,
and
you don't
so
know and
because this is such a I agree, it's a very predominant way of looking at children. I would imagine lots of people hear this part of the conversation and say कि हाँ और क्या, like वो तो बच्चे होते हैं, of course उन्हें नहीं पता. So in your experience as a therapist working with children and hearing children, what do you find? Okay, is it really that वाकई में उन्हें नहीं पता होता?
See, I'm going to be biased now. मेरा तो कोई भी कहेगा तो कहेंगे जी ये तो therapist है तो ये तो यही बात करेंगी, ये तो यही बोलेंगी. But it's a very, I think it's common sense. Actually, it's not it's a therapist-y thing. It's actually a common sense thing. जब एक बच्चा पैदा होता है, like when एक infant है, वो अपनी sense felt experience के ऊपर communicate करता है.
सही.
ठीक? समझ आती है कि cognitions develop नहीं है. Verbal language is not there. I get that. But the rawest and the purest form of communication is the sense felt experience that the child is actually born with, So it's not a therapist-y thing, honestly, to say कि एक बच्चा आपको इतना छोटा है और वो आपको communicate करके बता रहा है कि मुझे भूख लगी है या मुझे diaper change चाहिए या मुझे सोना है या मुझे कोई तकलीफ है या मैं खुश हूँ, आपको देख के मैं खुश हूँ. उसकी sense felt experience से वो communicate करता है. तो इसी तरह जब बच्चा कोई बात कहता है ना, जैसे जैसे बच्चे बड़े होते हैं हम उनकी सेंस फेल्ट को खत्म करना शुरू हो जाते हैं इस मैसेज के साथ कि you don't know. You don't know. So we actually don't allow that the child's sense felt experience to emerge and help them make sense of it.
Right.
It's not that you let the child kind of loose whatever they're saying. You sort of let them do. Not at all. But you don't allow them to actually connect with that experience that they're feeling, they're having sensorially, literally in their bodies.
Right.
you shut it down, you give them a message, this is what it is, so I know better, I've explained it, ऐसे होना है, उसकी वो ability ही जो है ना बच्चे की दबाना suppress होना शुरू हो जाती है. सिर्फ एक चीज predominant हो जाती है. Societal norms, cultural norms, हमारे मुल्क में religious norms, ये सब कुछ बहुत ज़्यादा तेजी पकड़ लेते हैं एक बच्चे की जिंदगी में. So, you know, what you asked, I think it's what I experience is that for like I work with a lot of adults and I work with couples also. So I see it in, you know, how that sense felt experience when has not been allowed to, it's not nurtured, is not helped, is not nurtured, is not allowed to emerge and made sense of, and actually using your judgment to understand what's okay and what's not okay, when something can be done, when something cannot be done, how to modify it, how to adapt, how to adjust. वो आपकी further बड़े होके आपके relationships में बहुत ज़्यादा नजर आता है later on. So that's one of the things I think in my work I see in children, like teenagers. A lot of teenagers come and, you know, if the parents would say कि इसको नहीं पता. हो सकता है इसको ना पता हो सकता है, but let's hear him or her out. Right. You know, let's try to help them make sense of what they're actually trying to say or what they're experiencing at that moment. That space is not given. Right. And when that space is not given, I think it just has such long repercussions in your personality and your ways of communications and your formations of relationships and all of it. Like, aapko pata hi nahi chalta.
I was thinking it's so funny that the work that we end up doing with adults is often an unlearning of that, right? We do a lot of unlearning on relying solely on your cognition and solely on what you've been told to connecting with your body. So, for example, with a client who's coming in and saying, you know, everything has to be perfect, and if I'm not perfect, then I'm terrible, and they're overworking themselves. The work that I would do is, okay, but can you feel that your body is tired, and can you feel that your body is asking for rest? And I think that maybe is how, you know, that disconnection is showing up, that over the years growing up, you are repeatedly asked to disconnect from your feeling. Okay, you know, the hurt that you're feeling is not valid. The happiness that you're feeling is not valid. The concern that you have is not valid. And as adults, that creates problems. And then you come to therapy to unlearn that, to go back to that, like you said, that sense felt experience.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. You know, I mean, you were saying your hurt is not valid, your happiness is not valid, your concern is not valid. And I was thinking that, you know, just to cope with this kind of suppression, there are going to be so many coping mechanisms, so many defense mechanisms that would be kicking in to deal with that environment. And that shapes the child's personality, actually. And that shape then translates into, you know, the behaviors translate into forming relationships. And, you know, that's what we're seeing a 35-year-old who would want to do something, you know, who perfection and then procrastination because of perfection is just the behavior that they are stuck in. And, you know, that experience of that message of aise karo, aise hi hona chahiye, aise hi hona chahiye. Yeah, you know, that message, then the suppression of what the child wants in that time, wanting to please the parent, developing a certain behavior, which eventually translates into perfectionism. That if I'm perfect, then I'll be approved. And when I'm approved, you know, then I'll be loved, because somewhere deep down, that was not the case. When I was growing up, I did not feel that what I could say was okay, so I had to be quiet.
Yeah, I'm curious if there's examples of that you've heard from kids or even heard adults express that you would say, okay, as a child, if you had said that, and if your parent had received you in this way, then it would have felt validating for you.
Just working with a lot of teenagers, teenagers would say that, this is what I want. And the parent would say, this is not good for you.
Right.
Okay, this is not good for me. It's not, and then there is the parent saying, I do so much. Nothing is good enough for you. You're not thankful. The teenager is being a teenager, which is they're huffing and puffing. And the parent is completely emotionally burdening them with guilt of not being a good child, good teenager, being thankful, being grateful. And this is just, I'm telling you a snapshot of one interaction. This has a history of, of several engagements. So eventually, the behavior, how it would manifest is that the teenager begins to kind of sort of put it on side and they start pleasing the parent. Right. The message that has been given to them is that, when you get good grades, you become a high achiever, you do this, you do that. That's when, you're acceptable, you're worthy. So now, getting into college becomes so important. Getting into an Ivy League becomes so important. Getting 100% scholarship is so important. That nothing else, like the child may not even know that they don't want to become this, just take on this profession, but because, that's what they have been hearing and that's how they've attached their self-esteem, their self-worth, they just continue to, do that behavior. But, Tooba, interestingly, one thing that I say this a lot of times and I've observed this, is that as human beings, I think we have some sort of resilience or something is there, that kind of, there's a signal that comes out of us that tells us, may not even tell you, but there's a signal that, something's off.
Right.
So, this example I'm talking about, this child who's been given this message, is that the only message is that you've got to do well. You're a high achiever. It's a family of high achievers. So everyone's supposed to do better, good, brilliant. What the child wants is not paid attention to. So suppression to ho hi raha, sense-felt experience to ja hi raha hai wahan se. साथ ही message मिल रहा है, फिर एक behavior बन रहा है, But in midst of all of this, there's anxiety that's coming up.
Right.
There's panic attack that's coming up. There's lack of concentration. And these are signals that the body starts to give out, I need help.
Right.
Help me, get me out of here. Yeah. I'm suffering. Something is happening. So I think even if you work with little kids, you would, or any stage of human life, you will see that there's a signal coming. There's a signal coming. Unfortunately, हमारे culture में एक signal बहुत ज़्यादा parents उठाते हैं when academics get affected. जिस दिन बच्चा fail होना शुरू हुआ और results नीचे जाना शुरू हुए, उस दिन parents जो है ना वो उसको therapy में उठा के ले आएंगे. Or another point, when the child is a teenager and they start really acting out because now their circle is bigger, their cognitions are stronger, they have more they're physically stronger, they can say things, they can answer back, फिर parents उठा के बच्चे को therapy में ले आएंगे.
So also, anger is anger is a protective emotion, right? Anger is, I think we utilize anger when we run out of options, because I remember reading this somewhere, and I found it really beautiful, that nobody wants to rebel against their parents because they're your parents. So when children rebel, it's not that, it's their favorite thing to do. It's actually a last resort of protecting who you are as a person and your self-esteem. Okay, well, now I'm under so much threat that I need to be loud, or I need to be angry, or that ke koi sunta nahi hai, you know. So I have to be problematic enough for somebody to realize that I'm in pain. And
it's a plea for help, no?
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
a plea for help. That, help me out, listen to me, hear me, see me. And then again, if I go to culturally, anger, a child expressing anger is really looked down upon. Is really looked down upon. And parents are not okay. That's when, they start bringing teenagers in for therapy. ये बदतमीज हो गई है, जवाब देती है, दरवाजे मारती है, she stays out late, she stops studying, she's smoking, I found cigarettes in her bathroom. These are all expressions of anger.
Right.
These are all expressions of anger. If you look at it, teenagers will experiment. That's part of their developmental growth. They will experiment. You want to make sure that they are physically safe while they do that. You want to make sure you can talk to them. They know that they have that space where they can express that experience of theirs. And then you can help them make sense of, I get attracted when someone's smoking a cigarette, I'm curious about it. I'm excited to see what that feels like. But that will only happen now when the parent has given that space to the child to express what their experience is, and that starts from a very young age.
Right.
And that really lacks in our culture here. That really lacks in our culture.
As you're speaking, I'm realizing that when children come into the world, they're new people, right? And usually when we meet a new person, we have this understanding that we have to spend time getting to know them. हमारी assumption ही होती है कि ये एक इंसान है, इसके कुछ feelings, कुछ mannerisms होंगे, and I will get to know this person. But I'm realizing we actually never give children that space. I don't even think we realize fully that, oh, you're a whole person in yourself and I should get to know you.
Yeah, you're saying that, and I'm thinking a parent saying, ये तो मेरी औलाद है ना, ये मेरी औलाद है. It's like a possession.
Yeah.
So however I want it to be, it's going to take that shape. So what I am thinking, what I'm feeling, how I view the world, my child is going to do the same. So it's the little person is not actually a little person. The little person is an extension of you. And you want that extension to look exactly like you.
Right.
And take your wisdom, which I say it's parents, grandparents all have wisdom. Every human has wisdom. Even the child has that wisdom innately.
Yes.
And the biggest example is जब उसको भूख लगती है वो रोता है. So that's his wisdom, innate wisdom that tells the baby to cry and communicate that discomfort. So as children grow older, then children have a lot more can have a lot more skills. Only if you can give that space for them to express.
Right.
And that's where the work really starts when you're working with children. I mean, in therapy, a lot of times, teenagers come and they actually come and they just talk. They talk. This is what happened. This is what happened. And a lot of times, what I'm saying to them is, it's like, what you're saying. This is how I'm feeling. It feels like this is what you're feeling, or this must be very difficult. Yeah, that really sounds tough. Yeah, that's such a difficult choice to make. just like very basic, very basic reflection of what they're actually trying to say to you. That's it. And that's where the connection starts to build. And then, like any human, like any adult or couple, they listen. They're open to discussion. They're open to challenge. They're open to having inquiry. They're open to thinking differently, looking at things differently. But you've got to provide that space.
Right. I mean, you see it so often, in therapy or in relationships. Okay, people usually aren't quite ready to listen until they feel heard. So if I feel like you're not hearing me, then I'm not in the space to really hear you. But
Yeah, definitely.
as a human, what is it that makes this so difficult, right? Because I often wonder, or I notice in myself, that when I'm in my role as a therapist, you have a little bit of a distance, right? I can sort of say, okay, unconditional positive regard for this human to be whoever it is that they want to be. And when it will come to my personal life, right? When it's a sibling or a child or a younger family member, or wo as a human to human आपका value clash होता है, then I know that I feel like the surge of offering somebody a solution, telling them कि नहीं मैंने भी experience किया हुआ है, तो you shouldn't go through this, so you do what I'm telling you because that's what you should do. So how, just as a human,
that's fine, Tooba, that's fine. But if that's the only way you're going to be in that relationship, that if that's the only way you're going to be in that relationship, or predominantly, that's what your relating is going to be. You're not really relating. You're only relating to your own self.
Right.
So फिर वहाँ पे गड़बड़ शुरू होती है. Dekho, it's not, being a parent is not a very easy job. It's a very difficult one. I was talking to you and I was actually thinking about my own children, But I think what's important is, with that rupture, there is repair.
Right.
So sure, I go back from work and they're fighting. And then one of them comes and says, कि मुझे अपने दोस्त के घर जाना है, मुझे गाड़ी चाहिए, ड्राइवर नहीं मिल रहा. And I'm like, back off. मेरा सर मत खाओ, तुम लोगों को तो कुछ पूरी नहीं पड़ती, and I go on a rant because I just got out of office and then I have this whole thing in my face and I rant. And so sure, I ranted, but then it's my responsibility to, when I calm down, I go back and I say I was ranting. I was actually ranting. And let's talk about what were you saying.
Right.
And sure, the teenager can say, I don't want to talk about it now. And you take it. And you say that I would want to talk about it whenever you're ready. And if the teenager is really badtameez, you call that out too. That you can say it politely. Lower your voice and say it aram se, and I'll walk away.
Yeah.
So the repair is very important. A parent can't be perfect, Ruptures are going to happen where parents just aap keh rahe ho. It's a rupture in the relation, na? Like the person is just beginning to say, and you come with your experience that, no, this is what happened, and the person doesn't really find the space. But one, that's not the predominant way. Second, you pick up the rupture and you repair it.
Right.
And in repair, you create that space.
Right. But the really important thing that I think you're pointing to is the repair is on the parent. So the parent going and naming the behavior that they were doing, or naming their imperfection, apologizing for what they had done, being the bigger person, even when somebody's misbehaving. So modeling functional ways of engaging, even with dysfunctional behavior. What I at least find is that a lot of parents struggle with that. It's almost like we expect children to be the adults in the relationship. कि आप तमीज से बात करें, आप आराम से बैठें, आप अपना गुस्सा कंट्रोल करें. But when I do it, it's because I'm the parent and I'm stressed out.
Yeah. That's I think that's spot on how you phrased it. That's very well like that for the parent. I guess, there's so many parents have, like, there's constantly the fear of, I mean, I can go in so many directions with this, why a parent would actually do that.
Mm-hmm.
You said the imperfection of the parent, the fear of the parent, the expectation of the society, the norms, the interjects that they have been carrying. In all of these, they feed into that relating, into that forming connection, which actually doesn't allow them to connect to the child. They're rather connected somewhere else. And they are engaging with that set of, that box than really the human that's in front of them. So yes, the responsibility does lie in front of on the parent to be comfortable being vulnerable, being comfortable saying that, sorry, being comfortable saying that, I'm really afraid if you don't study, you may not pass. And, and yes, that's my fear because I have struggled with, and I have faced so much and I put that on you. So, that vulnerability, if a parent can bring that in with a child, there is no way that the child will not open up and connect.
Right.
There is no way, because hamara innately now we want to connect as humans.
Yeah.
And in that connection, we want to feel safe. So when I can see that you're saying something which is not an everyday thing, which is something that, you're talking about struggling with, it makes me trust.
Right.
It makes me trust you with what I have to say. So parents do have to model that.
Yeah. And that makes so much sense, right? In the same way that you would teach somebody to drive, you also teach somebody how to manage their emotions. So if what you're modeling is that the person with more power never apologizes, that's what your children are going to do. And I can imagine
how you metabolize that varies from like child to child. Some children would actually mimic that. Some children would submit to that. And, it depends on, there's so many other factors that, but you're right. Parent is the model. Is the role model that the child is going to pick up from, make sense of the world, put their self-esteem, their self-worth, am I lovable? क्योंकि शुरू में तो बच्चे के लिए love is like, because I belong to her or him, she loves me, I love myself. And gradually it becomes, I love my own self.
Right.
I can care for myself. But the first is that, and how does that sense actually develops is when you really give the child the space to be. That's when the child begins to develop that sense that, oh, she loves me. Because whatever I bring in is not disregarded.
Right.
And eventually then it becomes like an internalized sort of like a system in you that, I'm okay with my own self.
Say. Yeah. So now we're thinking of this again to go back to, what we were talking about, the child in these systems. We're talking right now about, primary caregivers, which is usually your immediate mom and dad. But how does that play out then in a joint system? Because like you mentioned, okay, there's obviously the child is a whole system within themselves. फिर वो एक siblings के system में भी हैं, फिर वो अपने parents के system में भी हैं, वो अपने parents के system में भी हैं, वो अपने parents के siblings के system में भी हैं. So what's happening to the child who's kind of watching or interacting with all of these different kinds of parenting?
One thing is that the child is actually not in the system, but is relating to the system, is engaging with the system. And the other is not necessarily that the grandparents or are parenting also, and not necessarily the parents are parenting,
Right.
But what we want to but what we want to be noticing is that what kind of engagement is happening with the child directly,
Say.
even with the grandparent or the parent. What engagement is the family में आपस में members की क्या engagement है? How does the mom engages with the father, the dad? How does the dad engages with the grandfather? How are emotions dealt with in a family? What are the messages? What are the rules of engagement that are actually present? These all of these are, they would manifest in the grandparent system, and the parent system, the sibling system. These rules of engagement will manifest or and across the systems too, and that actually impacts the growth of the child. For example, hypothetically talking, if the parents are not present, sometimes the grandparents take over.
Right.
That so that lack of engagement with your own parent has an impact on the child. Sure, the grandparent is parenting, and the grandparent has an impact on the personality of the child, and they may be very nurturing and caring and all of that, but there is no engagement with the parents. That will definitely have an impact on the child's personality.
Right.
For example, it's a nuclear system, and the father is disengaged, is there but is not really present, is physically present but not emotionally or mentally, is checked out. That will have an impact. The mom's engaging, but the dad's engagement is distant. It's unpredictable. So the kind of engagement that the child experiences has an impact on their personality.
Right.
Do they feel that they are being seen? Do they feel that they're being heard? It's very important.
Right. And then the question that this brings to my mind is, how do you teach somebody a skill that maybe you haven't fully developed, right? So if you're talking about, teaching an emotional language or modeling healthy emotions, modeling how to deal with your feelings, because at that point it becomes generational, right? Okay, at some point a child grows up not learning a healthy emotional language. They become an adult who doesn't know a healthy emotional language. That adult then has a child. So how do adults sort of go about connecting with their own emotions and then offering them to kids?
That's a tough one, to be honest. You were talking in the what was coming to my mind was I read somewhere we're victims of victims. So something that is going, like as you said, that agar wo system develop hi nahi hua, then how do you expect? But going back to that same point, Tooba, that I said earlier, I think there's something in human bodies, human beings, that gives a signal out.
Right.
How much attention do you pay to that? So you're disconnected, and your child is I don't know, is doing something to gain your attention. You're disconnected, sure, but your child is doing something. If you can pay attention to that, and you can speak to the child, it may actually lead you into something else also. Into some of your own process of that disconnection.
Right.
That disconnection that you formed with yourself. But it's actually a tough one because, जब आपको कोई new चीज develop हुई भी, so you kind of keep, it's like you're on a hamster wheel, you're running. A lot of times people come in, some life event has happened, they'll come in. Or they begin to then notice, like, it's time and again, something starts to happen. It's the same thing. My relationships are not being formed, or no one in the family is happy with me. Whereas, you know, मैं तो सुबह काम पर जाता हूँ, मैं फैमिली के लिए कमाता हूँ, मैं उनके बिल्स देता हूँ, मैं इतनी मेहनत करता हूँ, मगर कोई मुझसे खुशी नहीं है. मैं घर आता हूँ, बच्चे, no one opens the door for me. My wife doesn't sit any. So, you know, it's just like, so a lot of people, you know, people start to kind of question what's happening around them. But it's a tough one, you know, to kick off that journey of, you know, developing or looking inside to see what needs to be developed,
Right.
to see what needs to be changed. It's a tough one.
Yeah.
It's a tough one and an important one at the same time.
I mean, I think one thing that I always sort of go back to is curiosity rather than judgment, right? So when you hear something, you know, if you hear, okay, oh, I failed an exam, or I want to smoke, or you know, whatever it is that you're hearing, the impulse is to judge, whether that stems from protection or from fear or from societal norms. And if you take that moment to be curious, okay, what is happening? Why did you do that? Why are you struggling with this? Then I would imagine the other person might actually, you know, want to tell you. And then continuing to be curious so that, you know, like you said, the person can actually safely tell you their experience without fear of negative sort of repercussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of go back to the same space of allowing that experience to come up.
Right.
Allowing them to, you know, really verbalize what they're thinking or feeling, or, you know, boys grow up, they have erection, like they have erection when they're babies, but, you know, they have wet dreams, and they can't voice that. माँ से तो बिल्कुल ही नहीं बात करनी ना, बहुत गलत बात. तो जी अगर कोई single parent है and it's a mother, then how are you thinking that the child is going to actually figure this one out?
Right.
You know, so that space to actually talk is extremely important. I mean, as adults, wouldn't you want that space with your friend? If you go to your friend and you talk to her and you want that space for her to just listen and not start advising immediately, even if she's advising you, say, stop, bhai, mujhe bolne to do na. You know, doesn't the wife wants that from the husband wants that from the wife? Like, you want it from with your boss, you go, you have a problem at work, you want to go and you want to have that space. So it's a human, like, it's a very basic need.
Right.
Just because the person's tiny and, you know, you are like 20 years older, it doesn't mean that वो need खत्म हो गई है.
Say.
वो तो पैदा हुए उस need के साथ.
Say.
You know?
Which, so I'd want your take on something that I've heard, unfortunately, very often from parents, or I've heard it from, you know, kids who I work with. के वो माँ बाप तो नहीं ना अब change हो सकते. Or, you know, even parents sort of settling into that idea कि, oh, well, you know, whatever the reason कि हमारे माँ बाप ऐसे थे, or you know, we're still like so much different than them, but we're old, we're set in our ways, we can't do the changing, so you go and change. And I'm curious what your take on that is, as somebody who works with people. Okay, is there sort of like that time limit? Okay, well, now that I'm a parent, or now that I'm 40 or whatever, I can't work on myself.
I mean, I have a very direct answer to that. Is that no, you can. You know, not because there's actually your mind is one of the most beautiful organs in this entire universe, that, you know, that's given you the skill and the capacity and the capability to actually reflect and change and be introspective. So no, you can. So, you know, a lot of times parents would come in and say this, what you just said, कि इस बच्चे को पकड़ें, इसको ठीक कर दें, ये बड़ा खराब है. So what they're actually saying is that there's nothing wrong with me, there's nothing wrong with the system, something's off about this child, this person changing. But So when you're working with a teenager, I think that working with children actually, and teens, involving parents that's very, very important. Is extremely important to involve parents. So if you cannot design something where you see the parent and the child and the child separately, then you refer them for family therapy.
Right.
Taking on a child individually is actually you sort of telling the child in a way that the problem is actually you. So when you say to me, going back to your question, कि parents कहते हैं कि हम तो बदल नहीं सकते हैं, नहीं आप बदल सकते हैं, और अगर आप नहीं बदलेंगे तो आप देखें कि ये situation नहीं बदले. मेरे पास तो बच्चा घंटे के लिए आता है, आप बाकी मैथ कर लें 7 दिनों में कितने घंटे होते हैं वो आपके पास है, उसमें से 1 घंटा मेरा है.
सही.
So मेरे साथ तो बहुत अच्छा relation बन जाएगा because I am ready to listen.
Yeah.
And but the relationship with you, if that's not going to happen, then I mean I can't say much.
Right.
So I think advocating for the child is very important, especially if you're working with children. You're the advocate. Yeah. And if that means that calling out, that means calling out.
Right. Another I would like to think that it's a bit of a myth, but something that I hear very often is that parents feel confused because they've done the providing, right? Okay, I was there for you, we sent you to school, we sent you to college, we gave you food, all of that. Kya masla hai? Why won't you connect with us? Why won't you relate with me?
So, Tooba, I think, okay, there's again so many ways this can be, discussed. Like, first, what you said earlier, the responsibility is actually with the parent. When you just say this to me, I'm like, okay, you're actually giving me this task to relate to you.
Right.
Why don't you try it out relating to me? That's my first thing. If this is something that you're saying to me, then I would say this back to you. Mm-hmm. I have that urge to say that back to you. But I completely hear what you're saying because again, it comes from the position the parents have. The position in the hierarchy where, what we know is the best. What we have done is the best. So, क्या मसला अगर आपने पूछना है तो फिर खुले दिमाग से पूछें कि आपको अगर फीडबैक मिलता है तो क्रिटिसिज्म ना बन जाए आपके लिए. So actually physically you're up there, but then if emotionally and mentally you're up there too, then kya masla is like a question that what is your problem?
Right.
If you're physically, mentally and emotionally you're there, up higher up, then kya masla hai, tumhara kya masla hai? Yeah. But if actually aap ye pooch rahe ho aapka kya masla hai bache, and you're not emotionally and mentally one high position up, then you would actually find out
right
कि क्या मसला है. So ये जो one up position है ना माँ बाप parents की या किसी भी human की, मैं फिर कहती हूँ I don't want to demonize parents कि वो भी parents सारे बड़े खराब होते हैं, ऐसी बात नहीं है. We carry a lot of stuff within ourselves. Parents carry a lot of stuff that is unresolved. Absolutely. But किसी भी relationship में you come from a one up position, we wouldn't be able to relate.
Right.
And we won't be able to relate.
So I am, one of the things that I'm sort of sitting with as I hear you, talk is would you say then that there's a need for a systemic, a cultural dismantling of how we organize relationships, parenting in particular, but generally जो हमारा ये idea है कि relationships ऐसे होते हैं, because somebody has the upper ground, somebody needs to be listened to more, needs to be cared for more, knows better, that we really need to break apart that idea because it seems to be damaging people.
So there is there's actually wisdom in this also.
Mhm.
So it's not that you dismantle.
Hmm.
Actually, ये थोड़ा सा sidetrack हो जाएगा. But I'm seeing a lot of actually dismantling in my work also.
Say.
That, the children and the parent, they're coming here together equal.
Right.
There's a
Right.
lot of dismantling. And there are multiple, I mean, that's a whole different discussion, the factors that are playing into that.
Right.
So not entirely dismantling of this structure, but definitely paying attention, being attuned to, the other person.
Right.
Recognizing as a parent, you are responsible for the physical safety of the child. You are responsible for providing the child with certain needs for them to nourish and grow. And you are responsible for the attunement to the child's emotional and psychological needs. Again, I would reiterate that it doesn't mean that you give into everything.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that you give into everything. So if anything that needs to sort of shift is the stance that I know it all.
Right.
To the stance where, I can learn from you, I can get to know you, I can get to know your experience, I can try to understand your experience. I want to help you make sense of yours. I want you to understand mine. Do you see there's so many possibilities here? But I know it all, there's no possibility. So
Right.
I don't know कितना dismantle करने की जरूरत है या कितना उसको बदलने की जरूरत, उसमें चीजें ऐड करने की जरूरत है.
सही
कुछ और ये जो stance है ना, I know it all.
Right.
Definitely.
But that also makes sense, right? Because eventually the parent is the parent, and that they do have a responsibility to provide some structure. So
Totally.
maybe dismantling, not in the sense of parenting ka role khatam ho jaye, but maybe shift towards the parent as a facilitator, or a parent as a guardian, rather than
100%. I'm sorry I'm cutting you, but it reminded me of initially, when I started work, I was working with children. For a very long time, I stopped working with little kids. I used to work with little kids, So this was my pet statement to most of the parents, that you're the therapist. I'm not the therapist of your child. You're the therapist. You're the parent, you're the therapist, you're the facilitator, you're everything for the child. Because how, the attunement that you can have with your child, the child is with you all the time. No one else can have that. Really, no one else can have that. So I think it's a beautiful relationship. And, there's so much scope of, amazing things to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also that takes some of the burden of the parents, I imagine, right? Because having to be, the same thing, jo ki hum pehle, we were talking about perfectionism, right? And how it creates this cycle where I won't do anything unless it's perfect, but nothing is ever perfect. And that paralyzes you. And so you procrastinate and you don't do anything. So I'm also thinking that if, as a parent, if your belief is that I know it all, then you're also constantly carrying that fear. I must know it all. I have to know it all. I have to be right all the time. And that doesn't sound like a very pleasant place to
But
be.
that's what you're giving your child now. That's exactly what you're handing them down. You're handing that. Why do you think a child would be, would be so worried about grades? Is because that's what's been handed down to you. And yes, if a parent can create that space, they're actually first creating for themselves. They're actually creating that for themselves, and then they can create for anyone.
Right.
May it be their child, may it be their spouse, may it be their mulazim, may it be their, co-worker, maybe anyone.
Right.
But once you can create that within yourself, that flexibility, that space. It's not the end of the world if I don't do this way. For one example, you can provide that space to others.
Right. Yeah. As we close this, I'm curious to hear from you. Let's say there's a parents listening in, and they want to start somewhere, right? They want to start somewhere with that idea of, I would like to go and get to know my child today for who they are, not my image of who I want them to be, but I'm curious about who my child is as a person. Do you have some activities or things that parents could do that would again sort of facilitate that?
The parents have eyes and have ears. Best tools to have to form connection.
Right.
Best tools, like nothing like eyes and ears. And touch too, but चलो touch जरा हो सकता है ज़्यादा stretch हो जाए किसी parent के लिए hug करना या इस तरह प्यार करना. So eyes, you look at the face. Ears, you use what they say. Ask your child how they want to spend the next half an hour with you, what they want to do. Use your eyes, look at their expression, hear their voice, what they're saying, if they're withdrawing, if they're saying something, if they're avoiding. Take the lead, use your eyes and your ears to try to connect to see where your child is.
Right.
And then there are many activities. Activities तो इतनी हैं कि खत्म ही ना हो कभी.
Right.
So that's where you can start.
Right. But so it's about the quality of the relationship, right? Not in any one particular thing that you can do or not do.
Use what you used to use when they were born. आवाज आई रोने की, देखा मुस्कुरा रहा है बच्चा. So eyes and ears. You use your those tools then to use them now also.
Right.
To connect to your child. And I think things would be so better and easier for both of you.
That is a beautiful thought. I hope that's helpful to somebody out there.
Yeah.
Daheem, thank you so much again for your time and for everything that you've shared with us.
No, thank you so much. It was lovely talking to you.